David Cunliffe.
Mr. Speaker, I acknowledge the Minister who's just resumed his seat and acknowledge his role as the Minister of Regulatory Reform. His attitude to regulation is of course akin to the person with a chainsaw who can't see the wood for the trees and chops down both. Mr. Speaker, our view of regulation is it's a bit like a hedge. It needs to be kept pruned, but it plays an important role in setting boundaries for conduct to the benefit of the whole community. Mr. Speaker, Labor supports this bill, and in the third reading it's an appropriate time for us to sum up the reasons why we do. And it's worth recalling, sir, that this is an unusual process because at first reading Labor quite strongly opposed the bill. And we did so for good reasons, and they're reasons that were echoed in submissions, notably those of the Public Service Association, and I acknowledge the presence in the gallery of its Secretary Brenda Pilot, and of the Council of Trade Unions, and the strength of submissions from both was notable. Mr. Speaker, this is a bill where the government and the opposition have entered into good faith negotiations and made major changes to the text to the recognised improvement of the final product. It is an example where Parliament is doing its job both at Select Committee and House level. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to briefly summarise some of the key issues that were amended in the Select Committee, but before I do so, sir, let me recall first the overall objectives of the bill, upon which there is now near consensus in the House. Sir, it comes down to what kind of state do we want to have? Do we want to have a state which is shrunk to the point where it cannot effectively serve its citizens? No, we don't. Do we want to have a state which is intrusive and where civil liberties, protections and civil rights are done away with, as in the threat of bills currently before this House? No, we don't. But do we want a monolithic state where bureaucratic action by individual agencies fails to deliver teamwork or flexibility or cost effectiveness? No, we don't. We want a state which is able to operate leanly but not meanly, a state which is effective, a state which fulfills New Zealanders' aspirations for their communities. And to do that, we need government agencies to be able to cooperate together, and they need to be able to work in partnership with communities and thus to delegate functions and occasionally powers where appropriate and with appropriate accountability. This bill sets the legislative framework that allows that balance to be sought, and it has been much debated, much argued and much amended so that both sides of Parliament have been able to contribute to the outcome. Mr. Speaker, there were a number of provisions, particularly in respect of the State Sector Act component of the bills, which were abhorrent at first reading. Redundancy provisions have been improved, sir, so that state sector employees retain their redundancy entitlements unless accepting a position that is, quote, no less favourable than the one they currently have. No less favourable. And the protection of state servants' rights upon redundancy situations has been a bottom line for the opposition, and we have benefited greatly from the work of submissions in that area. Mr. Speaker, transition arrangements have been improved so that collective agreements and individual agreements are sunsetted equally 3 years after the bill takes effect, and we have removed the possibility that individual contracts could outlive hard-fought, well-negotiated collective agreements. So the idea that government workforce policy orders could trammel the good faith bargaining rights of state servants was abhorrent. And I'm pleased to report to the House that the Select Committee has rewritten those provisions so that the orders now specifically provide for the maintenance of all existing legal and good faith bargaining rights by employees. And the orders no longer exist. They are now statements which are not binding in relation to employment matters. Mr. Speaker, conflict of interest provisions, enhanced governance for delegated powers, strengthened accountability requirements and state sector financial reporting have all also been amended. Mr. Speaker, Labor still has some significant concerns about aspects of the bill, but we believe that the amendments secured in Select Committee with the support of unions, have brokered significant enough change that mean Labour can now will now support the passage of this bill. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take the opportunity to speak in a little more detail about some of the substantive provisions of the bill, turning first to Part 1, the amendments to the State Sector Act. The bill strengthens, sir, the role of the State Services Commission in leading the state services and to ensure that agencies work collaboratively as a system. They broaden the Commissioner's functions to include the ability to transfer chief executives within the public service as part of building a collaborative culture. They extend the responsibilities of chief executives to their ministers and how they delegate statutory functions and powers between agencies subject to safeguards, which have been strengthened. And they create new organisational arrangements called a departmental agency as an option for providing public services to provide focused and specific and accountable services within a broader department. Mr. Speaker, I'd note in passing that is in some ways opposite to the trend that we've seen with the formation of agencies like MOBI, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, which has collectivised so many functions into one disparate group, sir, that we have grave fears for its effectiveness. Mr. Speaker, Part 2 of the Act contains amendments to the Public Finance Act. It establishes a new type of appropriation called a multi-category appropriation, which is an important innovation. It means that when cooperation is mandated between several government agencies comprising several different votes of expenditure, that financing can be collectivised into a single pool, thus hardwiring the cooperation between those agencies for the project or program. Sir, it's a good idea in principle, but in order to be proper and effective, it's essential that Parliament is able to trace the money going into and out of multi-category appropriations as part of a broader set of accountabilities to ensure that all funding can be appropriately traced. And, sir, I'm happy to report to the House that work is ongoing in the Finance and Expenditure Committee to ensure that those accountabilities are detailed and transparent right down to the sub-output level. And we're working with officials to ensure improvements are made to the structure of Crown accounts. Mr. Speaker, amendments to the Crown Entities Act of 2004, amongst other things, require the boards of statutory entities to ensure that they collaborate where practical. They broaden the grounds for the Minister of Finance and State Services to issue whole-of-government directions, and they can be issued to large or small groups of entities. Sir, the irony is that at a time when Mighty River Power, or half of it, has been flogged off, the government is taking large parts of the state sector out of the provisions of the State-Owned Enterprises Act, which provide very similar powers of direction to those which we're now introducing in this bill. Would somebody please establish what the government really wants? It seems that they want cash, sir, even when it overrides principle. This is a bill that does contain principle, and so we support it. We absolutely abhor the dilution of the Crown's asset portfolio and the loss of strategic control over New Zealand's energy system, and that is why we are going to be introducing, soon after taking power next year, New Zealand Power, a system whereby consumer interests are protected, sir, and power companies are once again brought within the control of the community as a whole. Mr. Speaker, we retain a number of reservations about the bill, and in closing, let me just note that we have concerns that we'll be monitoring closely around redundancy provisions, around payments and bargaining. Sir, we are also concerned about aspects of the implementation of government workforce policy statements to ensure that they don't in practice trammel the rights which have been protected in principle. We're going to be monitoring closely any delegation by chief executives of their powers to ensure that accountabilities to Parliament and to the public are not diluted. And we're going to be working very closely with officials to make sure that the accountability arrangements in financial reporting are tight and transparent so that the public can get the information that it deserves and is entitled to ensure the proper functioning of government. Process terms, sir, let me express a somewhat a degree of concern about the extensive supplementary order papers, which we feel should have been introduced earlier. Not sufficient to cause us to vote against the bill. It does have Labor's support, and we look forward to working to modernise and improve the functions of the state sector.
Denise Roach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.